All right, and we are back. Man, it feels good to be back. Welcome to a brand new episode of The More You Know, and my apologies for being so inconsistent this year with uploading podcasts. I'm kind of disappointed in myself, but life has been getting the best of me, and just has really busy back to back weekends in a row. But I'm gonna try to be back. And today's topic is about money. And what better way to have someone explain economics and money to us than someone who loves talking about it? Can you give us a brief intro of yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is Anirudh Garg, and I am, among many things, a student of economics. I'm actually applying for my PhD on it right now. In addition to that, an author of a book about modern masculinity in young men, and I'm also the host of a podcast, which we generally sometimes talk about economics and politics and how that affects each other.
Awesome, awesome. I think kind of like the biggest question that I've been itching to answer for the longest time is like, what's happening in our economy right now? Because I feel like I can speak for a lot of people that do like grocery shopping or shopping in general, and I've noticed that there has been a increase in prices. What is this all about? Because I feel like this kind of just took place once the new administration came in. Is it because of them or is it because of something else?
Inflation is actually super complicated right now, and we're actually in a very interesting time for inflation because it's not a uniform thing. Not everything is becoming more expensive. There are certain things that are becoming super expensive, and there's some that are actually becoming cheaper. I'll give you an example. One of the biggest increases in price, according to the CPI, is energy. Our energy costs are through the roof. I think gasoline is up 44% over last year. Just the cost of energy and gasoline and all other forms of gas commodities. And here's the thing that we know in economics: we usually consider this as some sort of like supply shock, where because a lot of our food is dependent on trucking and infrastructure, increases in energy prices, whether it's as air conditioning to keep the food cool, or heating, space heating, transportation, all of those costs would be passed on to the end consumer. And here's kind of the thing: some of it is in the control of the Biden administration, a lot of it just isn't. When COVID 19 hit, the entire global infrastructure was thrown apart. Uh, we had shipping problems. If you remember a while ago, we had a ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. There were
Mm-hmm.
multiple incongruencies, and that made it very difficult for the global supply chain to catch back up. And we're finally back into a place, but what we're really seeing is a multiple different factors. Uh, if you look at just specific grocery food, food is more expensive. Meat specifically, because well, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't really eat a lot of meat. But from what I know, looking at the data,
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. Flank steak at Costco for like 3 pounds used to cost me like $20, and now it's $30. So I can definitely attest to the cost of meat being higher for that part.
yeah, a lot of that has to do with the meat packing industry. Because when workers, I think this was back a while back, they were classified on and off as essential workers in the meat packing industry. So they had times when they didn't know if they would be able to meet supply chains on time. So the price of meat as a commodity became very speculative. So now that everything is tightened down, it's more expensive. And on top of that, the energy costs of running factory farms and all sorts of animal husbandry related practices, those are becoming very expensive.
So like COVID has really wreaked havoc on like supply chains and like all that. Uh, the supply is not meeting the demand is just being passed on to the end consumer.
Yeah, usually. So I'll give you a good example. One of the weirdest things that's price has been going crazy are used cars and used houses. Used houses are going like crazy because lumber is becoming super expensive because that's another supply chain that was hit by COVID. So new used houses or older houses became more expensive, and also generally because people are moving around, the demand for housing is higher than normal. We're at like largest rates of internal migration in the United States. And on top of that, for used cars specifically, one of the biggest things hit by COVID was the semiconductor industry because we have semiconductor technologies that goes into all the microchips and smartphones and all the electronics that we have. That was thrown all over the place. It's why you can't buy a PlayStation 5 because Sony just cannot make them fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so things like auto manufacturers, when they're deciding how much technology to put in their smart cars, they're realizing it's becoming more and more expensive. So because there's a shortage of new cars, consumers are going to used cars, and that's why the price for used cars has increased. We're actually living in a very strange time with inflation.
That's very interesting. There's 2 points that I want to bring up. Well, I want to ask you. A lot of people have been saying that a good reason for inflation is because of the stimulus that has been passed. Because people have been saying that since there's just been so much extra money being injected, I think it was like a couple trillion just in like stimulus and like relief. People I see online are blaming that for kind of like the rises of inflation. Is that entirely accurate?
So there are two types of inflation, and I think sometimes people conflate them both. One is supply shock inflation, and another is demand pull inflation. So when people are thinking, oh, because of the stimulus checks, everyone has more money and they're buying up crazy things that's causing the price to go up. That's demand based inflation, and that there's really not a lot of evidence for that for most of the items that we're seeing every day. So the way that we track inflation is something called the CPI, Consumer Price Index. It's just a basket of different goods that the ordinary consumer will buy. Sometimes like things like cars, automobiles, houses, energy, all that stuff from a regular consumer's perspective. Here, there is a true statement that the money that the federal government made and the central bank printed did increase the price of commodities, but it wasn't exactly the commodities we think of. A lot of people, when they got their stimulus check, put their money into things like Bitcoin or NFTs, or they started using that money in investments. And generally, if you're a corporation and you got your PPE or and all those subsidies given from the federal government in both of those stimulus in all three of those stimulus bills, you had the option of either investing in your business or finding some sort of way to keep that money. Because of COVID-19, we had these supply shocks. There just weren't a lot of places for a lot of businesses to invest, right? If I'm a business, I love it when I can invest in my own business, buying new technology, new equipment, doing innovation. Those investments in capital goods to increase my production are great. Those opportunities weren't really there in the pandemic, so businesses started chasing other things. It's why today BlackRock is one of the largest owners of land. It's because this private equity company just started buying commercial and residential real estate. So the statement that because people got money from the government, it did have inflation, that is kind of true. It's just in the places where we didn't expect it to be.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. This better answers like all of the people out there saying it's I feel like it's mostly because of people with their political views that they're saying this online, saying that they're blaming this administration for passing all of the stimulus and they are the reason for the increases in prices. And that brings me to another thing that I often see online too is that the price of gas is has obviously risen from like $1.99 from the last administration to over $3 in some areas. I'm in the Midwest area, so I see gas prices around comfortably around like 2.99 to like $3.10, and a lot of people online, and it kind of bugs me sometimes because I don't think that this administration is to blame for the high gas prices, but it's people filling up their tanks and they are captioning it with, "Oh, I didn't have to pay $70 to fill up my truck when the previous ed, uh, administration was in office. Thanks, current." So, can you kind of provide some more outlook and like kind of explain like is this accurate to blame or is it because of something else that that they cannot control?
So it's a little bit of both. I'm actually in Texas right now, and I live in Dallas, so I'm pretty close to Houston, which is the energy capital of the United States. Gas here is super cheap, but in other parts of the country, it definitely is more expensive. There are two factors to it. One is that under the Trump administration, oil and gas had a lot of institutional backing. So there were a lot of subsidies targeted towards them. There were a lot of uh, deregulation schemes there to help the oil and gas industry because Trump's big idea was make America energy independent. And actually, under him, this was one of the few things he succeeded in doing, is he made America a net energy exporter for the first time in almost 3 decades. So that's something that he
Oh
did.
wow.
Now, the Biden administration, while they're trying to push more onto renewables, and personally, if I'm just going to be clear about my biases, I voted for Biden for that specific reason. But they have put back some of the regulations, the Obama era regulations on oil and gas, and say what you will about deregulation, it is true that when you deregulate an industry, the prices immediately are cheaper for the end consumer. So a small amount of the increase of gas could be attributed to that. But I would say that the largest increase on gas prices just has to do with just the demand side. Because at least during COVID, gas was cheaper because people weren't driving as much. Now people are moving all around the country. People are moving to places far and far away. When everyone moved to remote work, they were able to move to places like in rural areas near their hometowns where their family lived, their grandparents lived. So now there might be situations where the demand for gas is just increased beyond what was normal pre-COVID 19. So it's kind of hard to say that we don't have enough data to make a strong conclusion so far. It is possible that some of the Biden administration's policies could have made oil and gas slightly more expensive because of the regulations they brought back on. But for the most part, it seems a lot of it is driven by just the environmental factors and decisions that consumers are making.
Okay, yeah. I think that that definitely makes like a lot more logical sense when you think about it. And like I think people just don't like they don't see like the economic side of like prices. Like I don't think a lot of people understand that since like people were basically not doing much for like the majority of last year, supply chains kind of just adapted to that for the time being, and then with the sudden spike in demand now, it's gonna be harder for everything to get back into like normal.
100%.
Yeah. So I think that's like a lot of what people get confused with it. This brings me to another thing that I see a lot too. I see that normal inflation, like a healthy amount of inflation, is 2% a year, and I see headlines and I read some articles about how the Fed is kind of concerned right now because inflation is looking like it's going to push past like 6 or 9%. I forgot which one it was. What does what does this increase in inflation this year mean for the future?
Okay, so this is generally true. Just as a bit of a preface, the Federal Reserve has two priorities. They have two jobs. One is to make sure that inflation is between 2 to 4% every year, and the second is to make sure that we're at the natural rate of unemployment, which is about 4 to 6%. Now, on the statement of inflation being a little higher this year, there are a couple of issues when we're trying to talk about just the inflation number. First is context. The previous year, inflation was at 1%, about 1.3%, I believe. So, if we average it between the 2 years, the excess inflation we see today just might be a carryover from last year. We don't know that for sure. And another thing, at least it looks like we're on track to have inflation around, yeah, we're looking to have inflation of around 4.9% so far, annualized. And that could change later depending on conditions, but it's almost been two-thirds of the year. So it seems as though inflation might be, let's take worst case scenario, it hits 6.5%, which is what some of the Federal Reserve is predicting. Even in that worst case, annualized between this year and last year, it's not the end of the world. And with proper monetary policy, it won't become a year on year thing. When people are worried about recreating the Weimar Republic with hyperinflation, that happens when there's no faith in the government, no faith in the currency, and the central banks keep printing more and more and more money. We're a long way from that, but it is okay for some people to be a bit worried about inflation because inflation, at least at how uneven it is, could impact a lot of poor consumers, especially those who live far away from work, have to drive a lot, reliant on their cars. It could hit them the worst.
Hmm. And then generally, like if inflation is increasing but wages are not increasing, what can companies do, or like what can people do really to kind of help hedge themselves with it?
Well, so Here's kind of the issue because for a lot of people, at least now we're seeing a uptick in wage growth, which is actually one of the reasons why prices are going higher too. Because certain places, especially outdoor in the fast food and restaurant working industry, there's been an increase in wages because people are just not working unless companies raise their wages. Chipotle is doing $15 an hour. In some places, in my area, they're going up to like 16, 17. So there does seem to be a push there, at least because of the stimulus creating a space for people to decide not to work. It's created pressure on some companies to start raising wages slowly. But on a broader trend, historically speaking, wages barely keep up with inflation, largely because for a lot of workers, there aren't a lot of there's asymmetry in bargaining power. Back, let's say, 40, 50 years ago in the United States, there was a strong union presence. And so unions, they would act as almost a trust, a way for workers to collectively bargain and for them to negotiate higher wages. And for a time that worked. We live in a different world now where we have companies like DoorDash, Uber, where almost everyone is a contractor. So they're not a formal employee. The protections that we afford for unions aren't there. This was actually a story a couple months back that in Bessemer, Alabama, it was one of the places where there's an Amazon fulfillment center. There was a big a big push for them to unionize. And there were a lot of efforts from Amazon, both behind the scenes and in front, for marketing campaigns to prevent that from happening. And the union presence in the United States is just not very powerful. Now, Joe Biden is committed to increasing the strength of unions and supporting unions. I don't know how much he'll actually do on that front. But it seems that one of the reasons why wages are not keeping up is because the workers are just not able to bargain for it. And the fact is that there's a huge discrepancy between what type of jobs the economy needs and what type of skill sets people have. Truck driving is one of the most common jobs in a lot of states. But we're getting to the point where we're going to start automating more and more of truck driving. We probably won't get to the point where we can replace all drivers immediately, but we can significantly reduce the skill requirements to become a truck driver to just a person who watches over the vehicle while it's on the road. In that case, it becomes a lot easier for anyone to become a truck driver, and the wages there will start shrinking because the pool of applicants increases. So, unfortunately, in the short term, it just seems that people don't have the skill sets to prevent their own obsolescence, and that's one of the reasons why aside from collective bargaining, they don't really have the ability to negotiate for their wages, and that's why they're just barely keeping up with inflation. If we wanted real solutions, we would talk about ways for workers to have more abilities to unionize, though unions have their own detriments on a broader economy by drastically reducing output and the efficiency of businesses. Or we could create some sort of pushes for workers to be more educated and to have the skill sets necessary. I don't want to be the person who says learn to code as a solution to all the problems, but there needs to be robust investment in worker training for the new jobs that are propping up.
When you say that automation is coming and it's going to be replacing some jobs, that brings me to the question of what about college degrees then? Because I feel like a lot of people who go to college and they get a job right out of college. What about their jobs that could be automated? Like, is like the main way is like the main college degree way then going to be computer science then if everything's going to be automated? Like, is there going to be like is the value of like say a marketing or just any degree that can lead to a job where it can be automated, is that going to be devalued?
See, this is a much more complicated question to answer than inflation because believe it or not, the answer is very complicated because usually when we get innovation in forms of technology, there are tools that amplify productivity. If I go from having a calculator to a computer, my accounting work becomes easier. Now, it could also be the case that because I have a computer, one accountant is so much more efficient that I would need fewer accountants in a company. So, increasing the efficiency of a single worker could mean that you reduce the need for that many workers. There's a two there. The technology didn't replace me, it just made me more efficient. So, we have to acknowledge that sometimes technology can act as an amplifier of our abilities. We could have a situation where instead of AI replacing truck drivers, it just makes it easier for anyone to become a truck driver. So, We don't need complicated licenses. You don't need to pass complicated tests to prove you can drive an 18-wheeler. We have an AI that takes care of some of the safety mechanisms for you. So any person, any Joe Schmo with a driver's license can drive one. Then you made it a lot easier for a person, well, their skill set to be replaced by technology. So you just need a person to do a more menial job, which is just watching over a machine. You could have that scenario, or you could have the scenario where you create a tool that works alongside with a person that increases both their productivity. So it's hard to say. And on where it goes with college degrees, that's also complicated because we know for a fact that even the least profitable of college majors, let's say history, philosophy, literature, gender studies, they're still NPV positive. People who get a college degree are still going to make more over their lifetime than people who don't. Now, the returns are not as good as they used to be because of rising student debt, but it seems as though college is still a good investment because once again, it's a tool to invest in a person and increase their productivity. If you go to a liberal arts degree and you at least are better at writing and talking, that's at least an investment into you. That's a skill set that can't be easily replaced by a machine. We don't have AI that can do podcasts yet. So until that happens, we're safe for a bit. But I don't think that all jobs need to be CS. It's more or less what type of jobs are necessary. So I'll give you an example. We have a huge shortage of cybersecurity officials, people who work in cybersecurity. And since everything is online, we're more at risk than ever. We also have a huge shortage of nurses. This is actually one of the things. Nursing is going to be one of the new jobs of the future. There are certain nurse practitioners who are going to be expected to make six figures coming out of nursing school, and there just aren't the jobs there to fill them, especially in rural areas. There just aren't the workers to fill the jobs in rural areas. So it seems that we're kind of all over the place on what type of jobs are necessary and what type of skill set we're equipping people in college for. So I don't think we're at the point where AI will take care of everything for us yet. We still have other jobs, but the jobs we need are not traditionally what we think we need.
I feel like if no one told you about like the shortage of cybersecurity people or nurses, like no one would really know because like it's not really brought up anywhere really. But yeah, that right there is a very good point. And then getting back onto like the topic of like money, when you were talking about minimum wages, that kind of brought me to ask you the question of what are your thoughts of everyone who is in support of raising the minimum wage to $15? Do you find that like as a positive or as a negative for the future?
So here's the thing: raising the minimum wage is a controversial issue. So I'm like politically, I'm very left leaning, leftist, basically libertarian socialist is how I define myself. I care a lot about like creating good systems to help people, and when I think about the minimum wage being a good thing, I have to think that it accomplishes goals of helping people escape poverty or giving people more power. So there are some studies from the Congressional Budget Office. I think this one is one of the best ones. It's a little bit more of a conservative study, but I think you should always plan for the worst case scenario. It shows that if the minimum wage increased to $15 an hour, unemployment will tick up by 2 to 4%. But at the same time, we would have large numbers of people escaping poverty. So it's kind of a trade-off between full employment and lower poverty. Ideally speaking, a $15 minimum wage for the entire United States is not the best idea because while $15 an hour might be great in some areas like LA, it's not high enough. In some places like rural Wyoming, it might be too high, and that could cause a lot of disemployment. Economists are really worried about something called disemployment, not really unemployment, but disemployment, which is where the wages are so high, the wage floor is so high that there are some people who will never get the job because they don't have the skill sets to be productive enough at that number. That's really worrying for a lot of economists. Unemployment is something we can fix. We can do targeted investments from the government. We can try to build industries. We can bring jobs to an area. That's stuff we can do. We can't really fix a massive malaise of people just not having the skills to fill jobs. That's a lot harder to do. So generally, economists come to this number, which is a good minimum wage is about 59% of the median income. So across the United States, I believe the median income for the United States is about $63,000. I need to double check this.
Is that for a family or just for one person?
Uh, I think that's per person. Oh no, yeah, median income. That's per family. Per person is about $31,000. So 59% of that, it's about. I did the math before. It's like averages to around $11.28.
Oh
So
my
that would probably
god.
be nationally the median salary that doesn't cause disemployment across the entire country. But that number is problematic because, once again, we have different regions that have different needs. The smartest goal might be creating a minimum wage that goes per congressional district or smaller municipal area and having that tied to their median income. So you could have something in LA where it might be $22 an hour, but someplace in Wyoming it might end up being $9 an hour.
That would make
And
more
that
logical sense, I feel like.
that does. The only issue is that's not very catchy. That's not as catchy as Fight for 15.
Yeah.
So there isn't a strong push for that, but that might be the most responsible way to increase the minimum wage. And when you make that number, you have to tie that to inflation, because currently the minimum wage that we have right now, accounted for inflation because it was set in 2009, is one of the lowest minimum wages in U.S. history.
What is it right now? I forgot.
It's 725, but if we were
It's
to
still
count it for 2000,
725? I thought he got raised.
it's 725. Sorry, you got cut off.
Oh yeah. I thought oh wow. I didn't know that it was still 725. I thought he got raised a couple times.
Some states raise it. This is one of the funniest
Oh
facts that I
wow.
found. Trump won Florida by a huge margin, but at the same time, a ballot measure to raise the minimum wage to $15 also won. So it's a
Oh
bit more
wow.
complicated.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think honestly that would make a lot more sense just like if they were if like each county of like every state could just like make their own minimum wage to the point where like it makes sense for that area. But like you but like you said, it's not that attractive when you want to try to campaign or kind of advertise that. It could be a lot more trickier and not everyone could really under understand that part.
Yeah, which is one of the things that I like to try to do when I do economics. I want to focus on trying to make it very accessible. This is something that I've had to struggle a lot with because these are a lot of these are complicated mathematical phenomenon. Explaining that to people is very difficult. So a big struggle for anyone who's trying to make a good policy is trying to find a way to make it accessible. And that's just something that we're struggling with right now.
Yeah, like when people talk about prices and everything, they kind of just jump to like the very simplistic ideas that they see online. They don't really think about the nitty gritty mathematics that go behind calculating everything and like everything that happens in the behind the scenes type of thing.
Yeah, economics is not fancy looking at money. It's all just doing math. It's looking at hundreds of
Mm-hmm.
different mathematical equations and adjusting them with statistical techniques. That's mostly what economics is. It's just math.
So, when do you, in your view, like when do you think things will go back to normal regarding to prices, regarding to wages, regarding to unemployment stuff? I mean, unemployment rates.
So the answer is never. We're never going back to normal. There are certain changes that have happened to the economy that I think they're going to last forever. The first thing is now the huge push to do remote work. There are many places, there are many people who refuse to come into work, or they'll actively choose a pay cut for the option to stay at home. Whether it's because they have children or pets that they need to take care of, maybe they want to live closer to their parents and take care of them who are especially old and who might have lingering effects from COVID 19. There are many people who are just choosing to work remotely. That's going to change a lot how we restructure the economy. That's going to change the demand for roads, demand for cars, automobiles. Uh, there are a lot of things that are just going to do irreparable changes to society. Hopefully, I think one of the good things we'll see some changes in the medical industry where we'll no longer rely on just in time delivery. So, our healthcare infrastructure and supply chain
Oof.
might be a bit more robust for the future.
Wow, I didn't know that. Does the whole entire medical industry really use just in time?
This was actually a big issue back in the early stage of the pandemic where hospitals couldn't get ventilators and masks and PPE. It's because a lot of hospitals were operating on just in time delivery because it was a huge cost saver. They didn't have to keep inventory or stock different medical items like ventilators. So when COVID hit and they were overrun, they everyone was scrambling over the same resources, and with the hit that happened to supply chains, we lost thousands of people because we just couldn't get ventilators to them on time because we didn't anticipate ever needing more than just the bare amount.
That is insane. I did not like for the medical industry. I would have never expected that they would have been the ones using just in time deliveries.
I know it's very
Wow.
saddening. Actually, this is an interesting thing that I did. I talked about this way back when, but half of the contraction that we had in Q2 of 2020 when COVID hit and everything shut down, half of the contraction was just in the medical industry. Half of the economy's decline was just explained that in the medical industry, people weren't going for elective surgeries. So surgeries for like back pain, joint problems, sports related injuries, just because we weren't having those, there was a huge contraction in GDP because healthcare is such a huge part of our economy.
Oh my god. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. Actually, I have a question for you. How hopeful do you think you are for the future right now?
Do you mind expanding on that part?
Generally speaking, a lot when economists think about the future, we think about okay, are consumers confident? Do they think that everything's going to get better? And because if they think everything's going to get better, they'll be more willing to spend. They'll be more willing to invest. I'm asking you, do you feel confident in the economy? Do you feel like you can go out? I don't know if you already own a home, um, buy a car, start a family, all those things.
I am hopeful. I think things are just very out of sync right now, and I feel like you said earlier, like when you said that that it's not going to return to a new normal, and I feel like this is kind of like the redefining part of history where we're in this limbo cycle right now where we're trying to find the new normal. And in this process there's going to be high prices, high everything. Everything's just in discombobulation. But I feel like as we settle down and as this whole pandemic gets under control finally, I think we're going to level out at some point. And like corporations, the government, we're all going to adjust to it, and it might take like a year or two. I feel like maybe where we can get back the to a new normal version 2, as people could call it. But I think it's just a lot of it just comes to like teamwork with everyone, just doing their part and just stop like. And I feel like a lot of the freak out is due to miscommunication of news. People don't
Mm-hmm.
fact check themselves. They take everything at the face value. When like if you see headlines on Facebook, people just take it and run and automatically go with their gut with what that headline says. And I feel like just people need to do their part and do the fact checking themselves. Research it some more, and you just have to go with. You can't go with your bias sites. You have to like go with credible sites. Don't read a blog, and just do your do just do proper due diligence on it, because I treat news like an investment. I'm not gonna invest in something that is just being pumped right now. I want to know the fundamentals of everything. So learn all you can about it and then make your own decisions based on that.
We need more people with that attitude, my man. We need it.
Yeah, because like you're not gonna I don't know. It's just like for me I've been really all my life I've been more of like just looking up the facts of everything when it comes, cuz like for me I'm really big into working out and like supplementation, but I'm not gonna take something if there's not much like scientific evidence on it. So I always try to look for like the fact side of it, to make sure that it's true.
That is entirely important. It's very important that when we look at all of this data, that we also understand that one, we're not always 100% accurate in how we collect the data, and two, there's a lot of analysis that we still need to do. It's super important that be skeptical about everything, but also put in the hard work to better understand what's happening.
And I think that's like a common trend in like today's world is that people don't want to do that. People don't want to look at data. People don't want to read like the boring stuff about like a certain topic. Just like how everyone's freaking out about like gas prices right now. They don't want to look into it. They don't want to understand the numbers of it. And they're just taking it at face value and just going and running with it. No one wants to look at the boring data.
Well, the purview of that falls onto economists and people like me who are willing to talk about it and need to make it accessible. So I don't actually blame people a lot that they don't understand all of these things because, first of all, it's very complicated. I barely understand it. I spent hours trying to research it. It's very complicated, and people have other things to do. They're busy with their lives. I think that the onus is on responsible people to talk about it in a responsible way. So what you're doing right now, it's very important to have this type of conversation and dig deep into topics. And I think that this does a lot of good to counteract a lot of the misinformation that's happening.
Yes. I 100% agree on it. I think it's kind of weird, but like a lot of the influencers and all of them, they have kind of like the power to like bring the not sexy stuff into like a very fun way of learning.
Yeah, and that's incredibly important. I wouldn't consider myself an influencer. I don't influence anyone, but I do like talking about
Anyone
things.
yeah, anyone who's like a content creator in some type of way, it's kind of like an influencer at the
Yeah, that sounds great.
yeah. Yeah, Adrian, it was amazing having you. I'm so glad that I was able to get someone who can actually talk about economics and make it digestible and not throwing all these like complicated terms out and making me confused and probably would make the listeners confused as well.
I was a
Where
little
can
self-conscious about doing that.
no, you did good. You did good. I'm I feel like I got clear answers in a way that anyone can really understand it. But yeah, where can my listeners find you? Do you have your own podcast at all? Do you have any social
Yes.
medias that you want to plug?
My name is Anirudh Garg, and I am the host of the Dialectica podcast. I'm also crowdfunding and publishing a book right now called The Greater Man. It's a book on masculinity, about habits that young men can form to live healthy, fulfilling lives and creating a good paradigm for masculinity. That's currently right now. I need help getting that funded. So because of the crowdfunding, I have complete control over the rights of that book, so I can make it very cheap and accessible. I don't want to get it out to as many kids as possible to give them some sort of good idea for how to live a healthier life, counteract toxic masculinity, if you will. So I'm currently working on that right now. That's a great thing. You can follow me on my podcast, The Dialectic, with Anirudh Garg and my co-host Daniel Chi. That's one of my favorite things to do. We talk about all sorts of stuff from art to politics. And then you can also follow me on my socials, which I guess you will put in the description.
Yeah, yeah. Everything that Adrian has listed will be listed on my website, moreknowpodcast.com, or and in the description of this podcast. Adrian, if you have any like articles that you have on hand that you want to send out to me, I can put it in the link dump on the website, so people who are listening to this podcast can get more like further explanation or clarification on like anything that we talked about.
Of course, I would love to.
But yeah, it was a pleasure having you, man. This has been a long time in the making, and a lot of it has been on my end on failure to responding. But yeah, thanks so much.
Don't
for
be too
coming
hard on
on.
yourself. You're doing a great job. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk to someone about it and talk about my understanding of the world. So thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, and that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this show of The More You Know. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It'll certainly help me out in the algorithm, and be sure to subscribe or follow to The More You Know on your favorite podcasting platform like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. And Lastly, if you would like to contribute to The More You Know, you can head over to anchor.fm// The More You Know Pod and contribute any monetary value to help the quality of the show, and in the future bring on some more interesting guests. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate all of my listeners, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.